This week on Fresh Outlook, we'll look back at the week of ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Why all this time later are we fascinated with this man, and why, even decades after investigations, most Americans believe his death was part of a conspiracy. Then from a beloved leader to a reviled one, the circus surrounding the hard-drinking, crack-smoking mayor of Toronto. He has been stripped of almost all of his powers, but remains at his post, and defiantly so. We'll review the very latest and ask, why is he still in office? And we'll also talk about the first-term congressman in Florida, also charged with drug possession. Welcome to Fresh Outlook. I'm Frank Cipolla, and for those of us alive on that day, we remember exactly what we were doing when we heard the news. This week, we all look back at the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Years ago is dead.
Conspiracy theorists say they don't believe the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November in 1963 was the act of one man, even though a presidential commission said lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald committed the crime.
And so the verdict isn't out yet if you don't know all the evidence. And of course, there is massive evidence in this case.
At Dealey Plaza in Dallas, where a cross painted on the road marks the spot where Kennedy was shot, the conspiracy theorists hold court, sharing their beliefs with tourists who flock the area.
Certainly, the shots came from more than one direction. There had to be a conspiracy. The fatal headshot came from the front, entered the right temporal area, blew out the back of the president's head.
The murderer slips the net.
Tomorrow, on the 50th anniversary of JFK's assassination, visitors are expected by the busload. Some of the wilder theories about those involved in Kennedy's assassination include communist plotters, Cuban agents, the mafia, and even the CIA. The Warren Commission, set up by the government to investigate the shooting, firmly dismisses all these theories.
Dispatches you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
This was the most extensive criminal investigation ever conducted in the history of the United States.
50 years later, the conspiracy theorists are as convinced as ever that there was more to the crime that shocked the world than has ever come to light.
What sounded like a rifle shot.
Now, joining us to discuss the life and legacy of President John F. Kennedy, our former White House aide to President George W. Bush and Republican strategist D.D. Benke. Yannick Michkowski is professor and chair of the history department at Dowling College. And Christopher J. Klein, he's American history instructor at Westmoreland County Community College. We welcome all three of you to the panel. Let's talk about, first of all, many people have said this, and I've heard this all during the week, that America was never the same following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Are we looking through rose-colored glasses, or is that an accurate statement?
I think on several levels it's an accurate statement because, first of all, on that day, I mean, with the advent of television, we saw something that we had never occurred before, the death of an American president, and his wife was sitting right beside him, and it was just something that the nation had never before seen.
Well, we didn't see the video until several years later.
Right.
We knew that he had been killed, and
right.
we knew it was a headshot and so on, but a lot of the media kept it from us, how severe it was and what it looked like. But was it indeed a turning point in American history? Do you say yes or no to that?
I would say yes. Yes, because of such a young president. First time in modern American history that had occurred in that level, and I really do believe it was a turning point.
Professor Michkowski, what do you think?
I think so. I think before Kennedy, it was a time of confidence and optimism, and that shattered with his assassination. And in many ways, it was a dividing line. If you look at what came afterward, the Vietnam War, student protests in the 1960s, and high inflation in the late 60s, and then into the 70s. So it marked a dividing point where America lost some of its innocence and its confidence.
We have 2 yes votes. How about you, Dee Dee?
I agree, and I think a lot of that is because it was a young, beautiful family, and people really liked seeing the kids. And I mean, they were such a, not just the immediate family, but the entire Kennedy family. So when we had this loss, I think everyone felt it, and it was just so jarring and so upsetting. I mean, for us to lose a president, it's happened 3 other times in our history, but it was different because you have television. Even though they didn't show it, they talked about it for 4 straight days broadcast. No other broadcast, they just talked about this. So it was definitely in everyone's mind.
It was, I remember as well watching it on TV for 4 or 5 straight days, and it really seared into your brain. Why are we so fascinated with this man? Is it because he was so young? Because he had a young family, he had young children, his wife was a fashion plate, and so on? Was it because of that, or because of his policies? Why are we fascinated with him?
I think it was more or less a combination of everything. The young family, obviously, you know, the youngest president ever elected at that point in time, and I really just believe it was, as Dee Dee said, just kind of the overall idea of who he was, how young he was, and he represented a new generation within American politics, and again, that idea of who the family was. That young senator from Massachusetts had the dashing wife. Think back to his comment that he had the honor of accompanying Jackie to Paris.
Yes.
You know, just those whole ideas of who he was and what they represented, and even the idea of the young kids in the White House. You know, we're all familiar with the idea of John underneath the Resolute desk. You know, never before happened, and it was something new for us.
Let's talk. We'll talk about his legacy in just a moment. But his legislative record before he became president, and I've reviewed it, and I'm somewhat of a presidential historian, and you as well, and Dee Dee, I know, worked in the White House. It wasn't too impressive, was it? He was a line cutter because he wanted to become president right away, but he really didn't have a lot of meat on the bones legislatively. Am I correct?
I would say you're completely correct in that assessment, yes.
He didn't get any major initiative from the New Frontier past. And we have to keep in mind that presidential history tells us that second terms for presidents are historically much less successful. They have a slide in public opinion, they lose influence with Congress, they have potential successors jockeying for power and influence. So had Kennedy lived, I think his second term would have been even less successful than his first term, and his first term legislatively was not very successful.
Is it safe to say, as I have perceived it, that he was sort of learning on the job? He was getting better, and maybe he might have been better in the second term, but he certainly had some blunders in the first term.
Well, yeah, but I have to say, I think we should give him just a little bit more credit because, you know, he was such an inspiration to our country, and I really appreciate his economic policy, the Keynesian, because that is really more of a moderate to Republican. I mean, he was not way to the left. I mean, during his time, he really was a moderate, and I think that was good. So, you know how he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and, you know, in the space program, and I think he actually had some nice accomplishments, or at least the beginning of. I think he was kickstarting some good things.
Now, Professor Michkowski, you make a good point. Second terms are deadly for presidents because they can't run for re-election. People are jockeying for position. They probably have 2 good years before they become quote-unquote lame ducks and they start to work on the international stage because they know legislatively it's pretty much a dead end. Does everybody agree that his second term might have been worse than his first, or would he have grown into that job?
I think it would have been worse than the first term, and I think he would also have started to be strapped down by some of the things that we know that accomplished in the Johnson administration. I'm not implying in any way that he would have taken the same course as the Johnson administration did, but I do believe that would have, you know, we just saw Vietnam start to develop a little bit more, and would start to have been strapped by that, you know, and I just think overall it would not have been a...
No, I've heard this again and again, and I had a discussion with somebody this week that had he lived, we would not have gone into Vietnam. And I disagree. I think each president makes a decision based on where he is at that point in his administration, what's happening overseas, which often he can't control. But did he have an inclination to end the Vietnam War, or did he not know before his assassination what he wanted to do?
I think he didn't know. I mean, how can you know? How can you read the tea leaves with that? Because, you know, the Vietnam War was just so prickly. You know, it was a difficult one. And, you know, I think it was a complete bust and totally mishandled by Johnson. I think Kennedy probably would have done better. You know, one thing Kennedy did is he had a spine. I really think that in many ways, he was a very strong president, even as young as he was. I thought he did a fine job, along with his brother, Bobby Kennedy, and those two together as a twofer. So, you know, I think we should give him just a little bit more credit, and I do think he would have handled the war better.
Well, go ahead.
I think you have to look at the evidence, and there is some evidence that he might have not gone down the same path as LBJ. Some aides like Robert McNamara, Kenny O'Donnell said that he wanted to pull troops out after the '64 election. But
Was that wishful thinking and sort of building up his
evidence
legacy?
is stronger, I think, that he would have gone down a path similar to LBJ's. I mean, he increased the number of advisors from 900 to more than 16,000. His rhetoric was very tough. He looked at Vietnam as a test case for America's resolve in stopping the advance of communism. And his own brother, Bobby, said that he probably would have followed the same course as LBJ. So I think the evidence is stronger.
And he had a troubled relationship with Khrushchev. They were both trying to show each other off, and show each other up, and I think we saw that in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he certainly didn't want communism to be spread to Southeast Asia. Is it your contention as well that he probably would have gone the same path as LBJ?
I'm going to lean strongly towards that. We do know for a fact he was a strong believer in a domino theory, first of all, in Southeast Asia, has already been mentioned. But, you know, the other thing is he did have, as Dee Dee had made the comment, the appearance of a spine in terms of, you know, saying in '64, threatening to pull out some of the advisors from Saigon if they didn't make some socioeconomic changes and things like that. But I think overall he probably would have followed that overall theory, because we started our involvement in Vietnam back in the Eisenhower administration, and those advisors were gradually increased over time as well. So. Yes.
Another thing that I found out this week, which I was a bit surprised about, is that he was not too thrilled about dealing with, at least initially, the civil rights issue. That was something, especially as the election started to come in '64, that he wanted to be. Do you think he might have addressed it as Johnson did in the mid-'60s if he had gone through a second term? Or would it have been something where he would have left it alone and saw what was going to happen?
Well, he really didn't touch the civil rights issue until '63.
Exactly.
You know, so I think it was one of those things that just over time it had slowly pushed his hand, and he realized he had to. And I even think that was a political decision based upon the fact that he knew, we see the political realignment, it's rapidly taking shape in the country at this point in time in terms of what's going on in the South. So even in '63, he wasn't all that willing to take it on. But by this point in time, you know, you had the events taking place in Birmingham with Bull Connor and whatnot, and those are now front page news stories. So he has to take it on. And it's interesting that Johnson even took up the Kennedy legacy and, you know, saying this is what we need to take to completion.
Johnson came from a different place as well. He had taught school to underprivileged kids for a few years before he got into politics. He understood the South, I think, more than JFK did. Let me ask you the same question about JFK. Would he have tackled that or ignored the civil rights issue if he could?
I think civil rights is a very good example of Kennedy's ability to grow in office. Initially, he did show some moral insensitivity to the suffering of African Americans and to segregation. But the Birmingham protests in the spring of '63 forced his hand. He got on the air. He proposed legislation. He would have had a tough time, though, with Southerners in Congress blocking the legislation. And as it turned out, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended up being a tribute, a monument to JFK.
Is it safe to say that that piece of legislation might not have happened had he not been assassinated, or as quickly?
I think it's fair, because, you know, he was definitely focused on the economy, on the space program, on the military. You know, what his focus was, it just wasn't civil rights. It wasn't as much domestic policy. So would it have happened? Maybe, perhaps in the second term, but probably not the first.
Well, let's talk about the space program, and we'll start with you, Professor. That was one of his signature the things that he proposed, and it came to fruition with man landing on the moon and returning safely by the end of the decade, the '60s. But there was indications as well in that late first term that he wasn't thrilled about the space program. It could have gone either way. Am I correct?
That is right. There's nothing in his past history that indicated interest in space as a senator, and even as a president-elect. He didn't show a lot of interest in what NASA was doing. But he realized in his first term, in his first months, that he had to do something, especially after the Bay of Pigs, especially after Yuri Gagarin got into space, that he had to do something to bolster America's space program. And he saw it as a way to boost America's prestige. Eisenhower, incidentally, vehemently disagreed with him on that. Eisenhower thought that sending men to the moon was a bad idea and a waste of taxpayer money.
Dee Dee says no, but we'll have to wait.
I just think Kennedy was a great president for the military and for NASA.
Okay, when we come back, the former Secret Service agent who attempted to save John F. Kennedy speaks out, and a look at the growing number, the ever-growing number of conspiracy theories surrounding President Kennedy's death. We'll be right back.